So yes, we are very, very excited to partner with the Hampton History Museum as we bring the Port Hampton lecture series to you all. Thank you so very much for weathering a Virginia storm. To some of us, it was just a little rain, but to others, it was a storm. So thank you so very much. And to our audience watching virtually, thank you so much for chiming in. From the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, this is an amazing partnership that I have the pleasure of introducing our guest speaker this evening. His name is Mr. John J. Hanrahan, and he grew up in Cranston, Rhode Island, better known as Jack. He received his undergraduate degree from Boston College and 2 master's degrees and a PhD from Indiana University. Spent a little time there.
Did. That's where I met that beautiful woman.
Aha, yes. Jack's career in marketing took him to Chicago with Leo Burnett Company, Atlanta with the Coca-Cola Company, and New York City with Hanrahan Media Services. Jack and his lovely wife, Lisa, who is with us this evening, have since retired to Charlottesville, Virginia, where they volunteer with several community service organizations. For over a decade, Jack has volunteered with the Legal Aid Justice Center and with the Friends of the Jefferson Madison Regional Library. He also serves there as the board of directors of the Friends of the Library. Traveling Freedom's Road, Frederick Douglass in Maryland, is his second book. The first being Traveling Freedom's Road, a guide to exploring our civil rights history, combines sharing history of our civil rights movement with detailed traveled advice on how and where to understand that movement through travel. Traveling Freedom's Road, a guide to exploring our civil rights history, was selected as the best nonfiction travel book in the 2022 Best Indie Book Awards competition. And in 2023, the book was selected as the best book in African American history culture category by the Next Generation Indie Book Awards. So we do have an award-winning author in the midst. In the summary of our presentation this evening, all travel can expand one's knowledge and outlook. Traveling to the historic places of the Black freedom struggle can be easily moving. It can spark a desire to learn more about the courageous men and women, well-known and otherwise, who strove to make our nation live up to our founding principle that all are created equal. This evening's presentation will focus on experiencing both an historic movement and a historic figure. The movement is in the civil rights era of the mid-20th century, and the figure is the 19th century American icon, Mr. Frederick Douglass. Our speaker this evening has published books on both topics, which he has them here with us this evening. His civil rights movement travel book not only covers the major sites where our civil rights history occurred, but also places across the South and beyond where one can connect with Black history. His recently published book on Frederick Douglass offers a guided historical tour of over 4 dozen Douglass-related sites in Maryland. Family, friends, please help me welcome tonight's special guest, Mr. Jack Hanrahan.
Thank you so much, Gabe. Thank you. Thank you for that very kind and generous introduction. I am so pleased to be here. Thank you for my wife for putting up with a tough drive. This is such a historic town, historic area, that it was quite an honor to be asked to speak at the Hampton History Museum. Tonight I'm going to take you through those 2 books that Gabe talked about. I'm going to spend probably a little bit more time on the Civil Rights era book and about 20 minutes maybe on the Frederick Douglass book, leaving some time for questions at the end. 2 of the audience members are going to help me. Gabe is going to play the role of Dr. Martin Luther King, speaking at the Montgomery Bus Boycott Night 1, December 5th, 1955. So we're in the 70th anniversary of the Rosa Parks' refusal to move her seat. Chip and I discovered in our conversation that we're both Rhode Islanders. What's the chance? 2 of us actually got out, I guess. And Chip, what? Of the Navy, yeah. So Chip is going to do an interpretation of the speech Frederick Douglass did in Philadelphia in 1862, arguing that the blacks in the country should get into the Civil War. And I'll tell more about the timing of that and all. I like to move around, so if I get in the way of the slides, there's another one over there. I'll try not to do it. Where did this book come from? It came from a feeling that something was missing. So in your life, have you ever felt like you couldn't connect with something? Maybe as simple as a remote control. Something is missing, as simple as that. But friendships, people who you haven't seen in a while and you want to reconnect with them. In my case, it was the civil rights movement. Not that I was connected to it at all, but when I'm a high school student, 1963, I'm a freshman, 1963 in Birmingham, the Children's March causes barking dogs to come out, hoses to be turned on, and black citizens to be pulverized by that water. A couple of months later, John F. Kennedy gets on television. He's talking about we need to be more tolerant as a society. That evening, Medgar Evers is assassinated in his driveway. In September of that year, the 4 little girls at the Birmingham 16th Street Baptist Church, they're killed with a bomb that's set off in the March on Washington. So as a freshman in high school, I'm like very interested in politics, very interested in the news, and hearing these things from my home in Cranston, Rhode Island. And that sparked an interest in that someday I would go back to these sites, I would see these sites. And so Alyssa and I made a trip in 2018, thankfully before the pandemic, and all the museums were operating under normal schedules. And we spent a couple of weeks, more than a couple of weeks, visiting the cities that I'm going to talk about and maybe a few others. So out of that interest comes an interest in writing this particular book. Didn't plan on writing a book, but I would talk to my friends about what the experience was like, how moving it was, how important it was, how challenging it was to put that trip together. And one of them said, well, you should write a book. And I asked, would you read a chapter if I wrote one? And he did. He said, it's pretty good, probably do better, but keep writing. And writing that book, you encounter, because it deals not just with the civil rights movement, it's more broadly based with African American history. And the contact with the intersection of that history with Frederick Douglass happens over and over again. You do something about Harriet Tubman and the home that is now a National Park Service site in Auburn, New York. You talk. He and Harriet Tubman were contemporaries and knew each other, etc. So you encounter Douglass, and at the end of writing that book, I needed to know more about Frederick Douglass, and that's what caused this second book to come out. The Civil Rights Era book focuses primarily on these dozen or so destinations. You can see it's kind of an irregularly, almost boot-shaped loop that I put in the book. You can enter it at any point. So if you live in Texas, the entry point would be Jackson, Mississippi, and you might go around the entire loop. Just north of this loop is Greensboro, North Carolina, where the sit-ins happened in 1960. Greensboro doesn't have as much total civil rights history as some of these other cities, so I left it off of the loop, but it's definitely included in the book in a fashion that I'll talk more about. So somebody from Virginia could easily get to Atlanta, either by a flight from your local airport and drive the route, or drive down there and make the journey. And that's a 2-week trip. You don't have to do all of it at once. You could do this loop here and exclude that part. So it's a very flexible trip to take. The history doesn't only happen in those dozen or so cities. And so to capture more of the history and share more of the history, it has a separate chapter on the history that took place in Georgia, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Tennessee, and Arkansas. Separate chapters on those places where some of the other destinations, all of the other destinations, in fact, are. I couldn't stop there, and I thought it was important to cover what went on in the state of Florida. Some of the worst violence against black citizens happened in the state of Florida. South Carolina, student protests in 1968 in Orangeburg. Louisiana, events I never had heard about in, which one? Well, there's the march, the Baton Rouge march, which was twice as long as the Selma March. You don't hear about that particular march, but that needs to be covered, and it was covered in the book. I couldn't stop there. I thought, you can't have this history just confined to the South. There are places all over the country where people can connect with this important story, not just civil rights story, but African American history. So any state in the nation has at least a border on the states that are covered. So Colorado is covered. If you live in New Mexico, you could go west to Arizona, north to Colorado, or east to Texas or Oklahoma. So the book is hefty. You can see it over there. It's 500 plus pages. But tonight I want to highlight a few of the destinations. And this is where we're going to visit with Rosa Parks and Dr. King in Montgomery, because I want to start there. So December 1st, Rosa Parks is coming home from work. You all know the story. She says, I'm not going to move from this seat. She gets arrested, and E.D. Nixon, the NAACP president, says we need to do something, and they help Mrs. Parks, and he recruits Martin Luther King. Calls Dr. King, who's just recently come to Montgomery. He's only 26 at that point, new pastor. He's the third call that E.D. Nixon makes. He says, Reverend, I need you to come to a meeting. We're going to have all the pastors come together. Mrs. Parks was arrested. Martin, a little bit new, wants to play it a little slow. He says, let me think about this, and you call me back. Mr. Nixon finishes his rounds. He calls King back. He says, Reverend, have you made up your mind? He says, yeah, I'm in. He says, well, that's great, because all these 19 ministers are meeting at your church tomorrow. So he was a man who got things done. He was a Pullman porter, and his house is memorialized properly in Montgomery, and one of the stops that's recommended as you go from Montgomery to Selma. That night, not that night, but 2 nights later, 2 days later, the boycott begins. It's a rainy Monday. And so without those buses, many people had to walk. And that evening, there's a meeting at the Holt Street Baptist Church. And the Holt Street Baptist Church, sadly, right now is in pretty bad disarray. But it's definitely worth a place to go, because it's one of those sacred places, church or otherwise, that an important historic event. And to capture that night, I've asked Gabe. Gabe is going to do the Martin Luther King. There's hundreds of people inside the church. There's thousands of people who couldn't get in. And Dr. King puts his marker down on what is American democracy, what is patriotism. Gabe, if I could ask you to talk to us. And since we're in church, when Gabe does this, if you want to inject any affirmations, Liz is passing out a script that Gabe has, and there's some things for the audience to say. Be free to improvise.
Please do, help me out. I'm no Dr. King. But as this excerpt is from Holt Street Baptist Church on December 5th, 1955. And Dr. King addresses the people. My friends, we are certainly very happy to see each of you out this evening. Yes. We are here this evening for serious business, right?
Oh, yeah, oh, yeah.
All right. We're here in the general sense because first and foremost, we are American citizens.
Mm-hmm.
All right, and we're determined to apply our citizenship to the fullness of its meaning.
The full.
That's right. So we're also here because of our love for democracy, yeah?
Yeah, oh yeah, yeah, right.
And because of our deep-seated belief that democracy transformed from thin paper to thin action is the greatest form of government on earth.
Oh, it is. Yeah.
That's right.
Thank you. So that is one of the places that you should go. Dr. King's church is a place to visit. The parsonage is a really moving spot to be. King heard voices in that kitchen, and you go in that kitchen, and you swear that you're back in the 1950s and 60s. There's some great museums. Rosa Parks, we were talking about Mrs. Parks. There's a museum in her name, the Rosa Parks Museum, at the stop where she refused to get off. What was the Empire Theater is now a museum. The Equal Justice Initiative, run by Brian Stevenson, has two great facilities. The Legacy Museum, which deals with the issues like mass incarceration, the bizarre laws that have been passed and upheld by the Supreme Court in this country, and the museum, if you want to call it, or the memorial dedicated to the victims of lynching. And lynching is a crime that was committed way outside the South, and you walk by these hanging coffin-like structures, walk by them at the beginning, and then as you go through the museum or through the memorial, you are lifting your head for an obvious impact. The book recommends taking the historic highway from Montgomery to Selma, Highway 80. On the way, you'll pass a memorial to a Detroit housewife, Viola Liuzzo, who was killed by Klan members as she was driving civil rights workers coming back from the Selma to Montgomery event. Everybody's bucket list in the interested in civil rights history might have crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge on their wish list. The one thing I wish I had done is to bring headphones. That is an extremely busy highway. I don't know how that photograph was taken with not a single truck or car, but take some headphones, take something from Dr. King, take some spiritual music, sit on one side of the bridge before you walk over, and then when you feel it, go for it. Selma March was initiated by a crime that took place in Marion, Alabama. Marion's about 25 minutes north, and I recommend people going there to honor Jimmy Lee Jackson. Jimmy Lee was trying to protect his mom, his grandfather, when a march trying to get Reverend Orange out of jail was broken up by the police. People scattered, they were chased. He went into a cafe with his mom and his grandparents, and was shot. No penalty was ever paid by the officer that shot him. And this church is where they were meeting before the march to get Reverend Orange out of jail took place. From there, you'd head west into Mississippi. You wouldn't go to this next stop right away, but eventually I would recommend going to the sacred sites that are available to visitors interested in the Emmett Till story. Emmett Till, I think his biography is pretty well known. All the attention that's been paid, rightful attention that's been paid with the National Memorial and Monument to him, both in this area, the Delta, and in Chicago. That's where he grew up. He went on a train ride with his cousin to visit his other cousins, his Mississippi cousins, and his Uncle Mose. And, he was a city kid, not all that familiar with some of the ways of Mississippi. And there was an incident in a grocery store where supposedly he insulted the woman. That was what he was accused of by her husband. Her husband and an associate kidnapped him, murdered him. The murderers were found not guilty, but then a month later confessed to Look magazine and were paid handsomely for the story. When you go there, you'll see this, maybe even less than this now. This is 2018 photo that I took. This is the backside of the Bryant's grocery store, way overgrown. Right next to him is this pristine, restored with a $250,000 grant from the Mississippi Archives and History Department. This is owned by the same people that own the grocery store. This is the Trimble family. There was a Trimble on the jury that found Milam and Bryant, the two perpetrators of the act, not guilty. And that, just one of those things that makes this an emotional experience to go visit these sites. Also making it an emotional thing is when you see the violence that's still perpetrated to today. There's two river sites where no one knows exactly where Emmett Till's body was removed from the Tallahatchie River, but one of the sites is Grable Landing, which is this. We went right by it. We went by it and said, it's supposed to be somewhere along here. There's supposed to be a marker like this. We didn't know if it would have bullet holes like this one does. And so I got out of the car, and this is almost covered over by the overgrowth, and the river's out that way. Now, today, I've not seen it, but there was a sign purportedly made that would be unable to be harmed by bullets, unable to be sawed off, and that would have alarms go off if anybody tries to do anything, fabricated by a company in Brooklyn. So there's a chapter devoted to each of those 12 cities. The book goes beyond those to cover other states in the South, like I said, including Virginia. You have a lot of history in this area. You have a lot of history in the state. For example, I didn't know this when I started my research, but one of the largest perpetrators of selling human beings, Franklin and Armfield, is in Alexandria, Virginia. They had a main office here. They shipped people south. There was another office in Natchez, Mississippi, I believe it was, where their second office was. They made a tremendous amount of money. Now that facility, like this one, is owned by the city, and it's a museum. We, of course, have Arlington National Cemetery. The book lists a number of important African Americans who are interned in that particular cemetery. One that I have the gravestone of is Lemuel Penn, a lieutenant colonel in the Army, an associate superintendent of schools in Washington, D.C. He's returning from Fort Benning, Georgia, back to his home. Klansmen pull up, murder him, are let off scot-free. Just before, you can see perhaps you can see the date of his death, July 11th. Just the week before, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was signed by the president. And even though those guys got off, they were prosecuted by the federal government as a violation of Lemuel Penn's civil rights and were found guilty of that. You have historic sites in Hampton County that relate to the rebellion led by Nat Turner. Let me turn how am I doing on time? I'm doing all right, I think. Let me turn my attention to the Hampton Roads area. You have an historic university here, founded 3 years after the Civil War. Its emancipation oak is one of the most important, famous trees in the world, where one of the early readings, some books say it was the first reading of the Emancipation Proclamation in the South, took place. They have a great museum over there. Probably all of you have visited. You have Fort Monroe. Fort Monroe, of course, is where the 1619 landing site is. I believe there's a monument that's supposed to be coming online sometime soon. We all will probably want to get there to see that. But the story I really love is the story of Benjamin Butler, this handsome man from Lowell, Massachusetts, not so much, who's had a sentry from the state of Vermont. And this sentry one day encounters 3 men who've escaped their enslavement rowing across the river, and they want to come in. They want to come into the fort. And the sentry probably could, we think of what kind of experiences he had with black people in Vermont. It's mind-boggling, but he lets them in and takes them to Butler, who decides that these are now what becomes known as contrabands of war, the term that Butler coins. Butler goes out and meets the Confederate, I don't know what his rank was, colonel. It's in the book, but I can't remember what it was. It's not important. The Confederate Carey is his last name. He wants those 3 men back. He wants to see those people back where they belong. And Butler says, why? He says, well, the Fugitive Slave Act forces you to return those. And Butler says, well, Butler was a lawyer. Their Fugitive Slave Act applies in the United States. And just the day or so before, Virginia had seceded from the Union. So Virginia had nullified the fugitive slave law. Where's that water gone? Oh, there it is. I need a drink. Excuse me. Moving away from this area, one of the more historic events of the Civil Rights era, in my opinion, took place in Farmville, Virginia, at the Moton High School, now a museum. 1951, there's a student protest led by Barbara Johns. Barbara Johns is 16 years old. It's 1951. Martin Luther King is still in seminary school, so for the courage of this young woman who engineers the students to walk out protesting really the conditions of that school. Their sports teams would go to other schools and see what their facilities were like, what condition their fields were like, and the basketball courts, the nets of the She said, this isn't fair. And they became part of the Brown v. Board of Education 5 sites. Her statue will take the place of Robert E. Lee in Statuary Hall in the Congress, in the Statuary Hall in the Capitol. I'm not sure it's in the Rotunda. I think there's the difference, but we'll see. So I finished writing that book, and I want to know more about Frederick Douglass. Something was missing in my knowledge base of Frederick Douglass. I knew a bit about him, but not very much. So I read this Pulitzer Prize-winning book by Yale professor David Blight. Fantastic book. Chip and I were talking about length of books. What is your term? Quick chews and slow chews. Well, for any book for me is a slow chew because I read at a snail's pace. After finishing that, I read Douglass's 3 biographies. And between all the input I've now got, I'm really so impressed by Douglass's courage. He was not afraid to stand up to anyone, any situation. The amount of travel that he did, he's married and he eventually has children, but throughout his career, but particularly when he started speaking on behalf of the abolitionists, 1841, he just goes all over the country. You think of the state of railroads in those days and the state of roads for carriages. His sacrifice was unbelievable. He never gave up. He was so persistent, whether he was arguing to a small group or if he was arguing in front of the President of the United States. And that's where the reading that Chip is going to do is going to come in. And he always seemed to believe that America needed to do the right thing, somewhat like the reading that we heard from Gabe and Dr. King. So I begin this book on Douglass, I think this audience probably knows this brief biography really well. He was enslaved in Maryland, where he was born. He escaped from Baltimore on a train, ferry, etc., all the way into New York City in 1838. He was just the most extensive traveler. He wrote 3 biographies, the first of which came out in 1845, which, because of that fugitive slave, well, the fugitive slave law wasn't in effect yet, but because people were capturing escaped slaves, he needed to get out of town, and he went to England, the first of several visits. He was such a tireless advocate for his race. He served or lobbied 7 different presidents, and he died at the age of 77, living in Washington, D.C. So in writing this book, I wanted to make it the best I could to tell his story in compact ways, using his words and the scholarship that I was fortunate enough to benefit from, like David Blight. And there's a lot of disappointment when you visit Douglass sites. I mean, the place of his birth has no sign, none. I mean, can you imagine that with Abraham Lincoln, who is, I'd say, another 19th century hero for the United States, and he has 2 NPS, National Park Service facilities. So no matter if there's a sign there or not, the book's going to tell you about it, and hopefully you would go. And even if it's on private property, I'm going to tell you about it. So the book covers the eastern shore of Maryland with a suggested 2-day tour that starts at Talbot Corner. On this field, historians believe that this was the likely birthplace. Down the road, there's an old mill. This is not the one that Frederick Douglass had, but it made you think like that this was the Levi Lee's mill. And in the book, at each stop, there's a selection from Douglass's words. So for the Levi Lee's mill stop, there's a section from his first autobiography where he talks about the joys that he had watching the wheel spin at the mill and fishing at the mill. And you just feel like you're listening to a 7 or 8-year-old boy. This is where he was taken. The Lloyd Plantation, you can't see all the signs, but it's private property, don't cross. We actually got thrown out. We didn't go up to the house, that's really a no-no, but we went down one of the farm roads, and they asked us to turn around very nicely, and we did. One of the places that Douglass's family is connected to is Copperville. This is one of 2 historic African-American cities in the area. At Copperville, there is a cemetery with formerly enslaved that served in the Civil War. The reason I bring it up is because his mom, Harriet Bailey, was born just down the street from Copperville. That property was part of the Skinner plantation, and Ann Skinner married Aaron Anthony, who eventually becomes the master of Frederick Douglass. And you can read all sorts of things about Anthony in Douglass's autobiographies. Down the road, not far from Copperville, is Unionville. I love to put this in this slide. It was originally called Cowgill Town. So thankfully they changed the name once the United States Colored Troops members established it. There's a historic church as well as a marker. And in that cemetery, there's 18 USCT veterans buried. Douglass was a big advocate for getting the black population into the fight against the rebel South. And at the Copperville site, I have this excerpt from his speech in 1862. 1862 is shortly after the Confederates, South Carolina, attacked Fort Sumter and later make inroads close to Washington, D.C., putting the Union on its heels at the Battle of Bull Run. Frederick Douglass wants the blacks in the fight, and in this next selection that we're going to have Chip read, he minces no words. Listen for the first sentence. It's a question, and then he answers the question. So Chip, if you wouldn't mind, grab the mic.
I should have grabbed the short one that you grabbed. This is a few paragraphs here. All right, I'll give it a try. Ready? Wrong line. I shouldn't say that. I should have read. Oh, that is the first line. How shall the rebellion be put down? I will tell you, but before I do so, you must allow me to say that the plan thus far pursued does not correspond with the humble notion of fitness. Thus far, it must be confessed, we have struck wide of the mark, and very feebly withal. The temper of our steel has proved much better than the temper of our minds. While I do not charge, as some have done, that the government at Washington is conducting the war upon peace principles, it is very plain that the war is not being conducted on war principles. We are fighting the rebels with only one hand, when we ought to be fighting them with both. We are recruiting our troops in the towns and villages of the North, when we ought to be recruiting them on the plantations of the South. We are striking the guilty rebels with our soft white hand, when we should be striking with the iron hand of the black man, which we keep chained behind us. We have been catching slaves instead of arming them. We have thus far repelled our natural friends to win the worthless and faithless friendship of our unnatural enemies. We have been endeavoring to heal over the rotten cancer of slavery instead of cutting out its death-dealing roots and fibers. We pay more attention to the advice of the half-rebel state of Kentucky than to any suggestion coming from the loyal North. We have shouldered all the burdens of slavery and given the slaveholders and traders all its benefits and robbed our cause of half its dignity in the eyes of an onlooking world. I say there and now, here and now, that if this nation is destroyed, if the government shall after all be broken to pieces and degraded in the eyes of the world, if the Union shall be shattered into fragments, it will neither be for the want of men, nor of money, nor even physical courage, for we have all these in abundance. But it will be solely owing to the want of moral courage and wise statesmanship in dealing with slavery, the cause and motive of the rebellion.
Thank you. You did a great job, not just in getting the power of his words, but I love the cadence that you brought to it, and how that litany of we, how inclusive Douglass was. You really pounded those things great. So thank you for doing that. And I should have had this slide up while you did it. So let's move right along. Then the tour moves to Baltimore. You could start in Baltimore. You don't have to start on the Eastern Shore. But there's so many nifty sights in Baltimore. The walk along Fells Point is almost divorced from Douglass's world. You know, there's more bars and souvenir shops there than you can shake a stick at. So you kind of, I talk about the importance of imagination in this book. Sometimes you have to imagine Douglass being living at a certain location in a neighborhood that now is really gentrified. But you will eventually, in the walk across the Fells Point area, get to the former location of the train depot from which he escaped. And of course, the train depot is not there. There's a huge apartment building there, but it puts you in the place where history happened. More than just Douglass was enslaved in Baltimore, and they are starting to do a really good job capturing places where the enslaved were held or auctioned. One of the sites, I don't have a picture of it here, a mother and son sculpture team created a beautiful piece of public art that's at the Lexington Market, which was a place where the enslaved went off. And it was dedicated to Robert and Rosetta. Robert and Rosetta were two enslaved people, contemporary with Douglass. They didn't know each other. They didn't know Douglass as far as his history knows. But the indignity that both of them had to be put through, not only from their enslavement, but once they were sought after, and I think in Rosetta's case, captured. This is right near another location, this giant head of Douglass, where he lived on Philpott Street, a street that no longer exists, but we at least get you to the neighborhood. And there's a museum, the Frederick Douglass, Isaac Myers. Isaac Myers was a labor leader in the black shipbuilding industry. I talked about surprises and disappointments. One of the great surprises was seeing this phenomenal mural outside a workforce headquarters. I think if this thing wasn't in there, I might have considered it as a possible cover for the book. I'm not sure. I love the cover of the Douglass book, so I shouldn't have probably even brought that thought up. But it was a photograph that I shared with the lady at the design. This sign, or you can't see it because there was no sign there, is opposite the house where Douglass was brought when he first came to Baltimore at age 8, where the Auld family, Hugh and Sophia Auld, had their home. I expected that sign to be there, and you can see it just has the post. So I looked online. I found a professor at University of Maryland, Baltimore County. I'm pretty sure that's, yeah. And on her blog, she had that sign from a bike ride she did in 2011, and she gave me permission to use that photo and to tell the story, not only of what's behind, how difficult it was to get this sign in the first place. There's a lot of stories that relate to Douglass, places that were really hard to get anything about Douglass, including in front of the courthouse in Easton, Maryland. That story's in the book. Lucy Cochran asked me to talk about Douglass's connections to Virginia. I said they're really thin, and they're not that pleasant, but I said I would do it anyway. Of course, he didn't speak here before the Civil War ended for reasons that are obvious, but he did afterwards. He spoke in Stanton, Virginia. He spoke in Richmond, Virginia, particularly at campaign stops. He would campaign for Grant, and he would come to Virginia to speak. But the two unpleasant circumstances, he was a friend of John Brown. Brown stayed at the Douglass home in Rochester. The story that some believed is that Douglass helped in the planning of the raid on Harper's Ferry, but Douglass took no responsibility for that, yet he was blamed for it. He fled the United States for the second time to Europe because he was sought after by the governor of Virginia. He was sought after by Governor Henry Wise. So he had to get out of, he was in Philadelphia, and he made it back to Rochester and across the Canadian border, and eventually. The other unpleasant one is not that far from here in Norfolk. He wanted to hire black citizens to have a textile mill, and some people convinced him that he should invest money and lend his support to it in 2 years before he died, and that was a scam. He was swindled out of his money. So I should start to wrap up. I went about 5 minutes longer than I thought. I really want to thank the museum. I want to thank my two readers, and I want to do that with more than words. You both may have read these books, but this is Rosa Parks's autobiography, My Story. You bet. And then this is Frederick Douglass's first autobiography. So as a thank you for being a reader, I would like to give those to you. Those are the only books I'm giving away tonight, though, ladies and gentlemen. That's right. That's right, we're going to church here. The people at this museum did a phenomenal job publicizing this. I mean, it's sad that the weather was not conducive to having a larger group, but maybe they'll have me come back sometime. Besides from me tonight, and if you're a member, I'm told that the bookstore is open because they know who the members are and I don't know who the members are. They'll sell the books that they've purchased from me at the member discount. I will sell them to you at one for the normal price, but if you buy two, I'll sell them to you for $45 and I'll pay the taxes to the state. You can also buy them on Amazon, so if your friends are interested in either of these books, you can tell them they're on Amazon, or if they just walk into any bookstore and say, I'd like to buy Traveling Freedom's Road, they can order it. What did you say, Lisa? Yes, there are ebooks, and if I ever have a free moment, I'm going to create an audio book of at least the Frederick Douglass one. But that's something for, my wife wants me to clean out the basement, and I'm not sure if she'll want the audio book before him, but there are ebooks as well. So thanks for attending. I know it's a tough night. Thanks for your attention, and let me know what questions you have. Otherwise, I'm going to tell another story.
I've got a question.
Okay.
And it goes back to one of the photos that you showed with the restored gas station.
Yes.
And then the back of the meat market.
Yeah, right next to each other.
Now, they're owned by the same family?
The Tribble family, yes.
And there's no desire, there's no marking or anything or any reference? Like, what is the significance? I guess my question is, what is the significance of restoring the property next door and not the meat market?
One of the relatives of Emmett Till summed it up with a word: racism. The family wanted they could get a grant to restore the gas station. They successfully received almost $250,000, and they did it. They never applied for a grant for the other site. The Mississippi Civil Rights Museum has created a replica of Bryant's Meat and Grocery Store. Not the same, it's not the same. The book has a picture of what it looked like in the 1950s, thanks to, I think, Florida State University gave permission for that photo. But it's just, they don't want to do it. They just want, we're all in an era where a lot of history is trying to be swept away, and they just don't want that to be, they want it to crumble and go to the ground. There is an historical marker there, so that's good. It's good in a sense, but I can only imagine what state that building is in 2025. We were there in 2018. You saw the overgrowth that's going to eat away at whatever bricks are there. A good hurricane will probably take the whole thing down. Yeah, but on the positive side, the attention that the murder of Emmett Till has gotten in the last 10 years. There's a couple of really good books. I mentioned it in the book. There's a book that he's at the University of Kansas, Remembering Emmett Till. That's the name of his book. It's a really good book, and he does a really good job talking about the story. The seed barn, I didn't talk about where he was murdered. He was murdered 35 miles west of Money, Glendora, which is where the Milam family lived. And that seed barn is now in private parties' hands who has an interest in figuring out how to make it available to the public without having dozens and dozens of cars come onto their property. And they're being cooperative. A gentleman that bought a copy of my book at the International Civil Rights Museum in Greensboro wrote to me after he got the book, and he asked me about how to connect with the people at the seed barn. And he did a phenomenal job. Some of you may be old enough to remember the documentary Scared Straight from the 80s. And anyway, he was the executive producer and won the Emmy for that documentary. So he's a good storyteller, and I hope that he has those skills to keep that seed barn story out there. Thank you for your question. Chip?
I think I'm strong enough without this. Oh, okay, I'm sorry. My wife and I I've been a historian many years, many years. But when I retired from my job in 2017, one of the things that I realized is that I hadn't been to a lot of the places that I have historically lectured on. You know what I mean? I just plain hadn't been to a lot of them. And so since 2017, my wife and I have been literally in our cars driving. We have a little show that we do called Old Folks Traveling, and that's what we're doing. We just roll out to all these different places. Because I wanted to get a feel for not just seeing it, reading it, but, how did they, who were they, blah, blah, blah. So my question to you is, did you do the Eastern Shore? Did you do the Frederick Douglass Eastern Shore?
Yes.
So you did the Harriet Tubman piece while you was there?
I didn't.
You did not?
No.
And the reason is because you can't do them both in a short period of time. One's going to suck up all your time. If you do the Harriet Tubman, it's going to suck up all your time. But one of the things and I ask you that because, when we study as children and they say, the Underground Railroad, the Underground Railroad. Well, to me, you don't have a concept of what that really means. I've been to the swamps, I've been to all kinds of places. But did you get a feel when you was on the Eastern Shore of how close the freedom actually was? Because when you study, you
mean
get a
geographically?
Feeling, yeah, because when you study it in school, you get a feeling of everybody coming up from, say, Florida all the way up to Canada or something, and you get this vision of these people trekking through and diving and weaving. But what I found, and I'm going to ask you, did you feel this way, that from where they were, because they were born just a few miles apart from each other, did you get the feel that I did of just how close they had to go? I thought they had to go a long way. From where they were to Baltimore and Philly gave me so much more perspective on how they were able to get off that Eastern Shore and how she was able to come back and forth so many times.
Yeah,
because the distance wasn't that far.
That's the key. For an enslaved person in Maryland, not to say it was easy, but it was geographically closer to Pennsylvania.
You could get there.
Delaware was a slave state then, so
So you did get that feel that
when you read, well, there won't be anything about Douglass's escape in his first two autobiographies. He felt strongly, you don't tell the slave owners how we're doing it, right? So, but in the third one, he does talk about it. He actually railed against people, like I think in the promotional material from the museum, you might have seen something from Henry Box Brown. Henry Box Brown from Richmond puts himself in a box, 3x3, shipped to Philadelphia. And then he goes on a lecture circuit talking about it. Frederick Douglass, didn't like that. He said, you can't go out there talking about this. The Crafts have been, recently a book has been written on the Crafts, husband and wife team, where the wife, who's very light, gets on a train. She has her servant, her husband. We all can relate as husbands. Yeah. So Douglass was adamant about it, but there were so many fortunate twists in his escape. He had fake papers. He's dressed as a sailor. The railroad on which he escapes just recently had been almost completed. He still had to take, what would they call that? It wasn't a ferry, like a transport, where he's on this side of the river. The train has to stop. He gets on something that takes him across the other side. I can't remember the technical word for that. He is seen by a person who knows him and who's a talker, and he just wants to get away from that person. He sees a person that he was building a boat for on an opposite platform, going the opposite way. Guy never looks over. I mean, there's so many close calls. That story is the longest. Douglass Speaks is what I call those segments where it's Douglass's words. That is a 5-page Douglass Speaks, because the whole escape is just riveting. You know, I talked about how great a writer he was, and the way he structured sentences and words. So I hope that if you do, you don't have to buy the book from me. Just ask your local library to get it, and more people will have the book. So, okay, well, anyway. It's 8 o'clock. I'm happy to stay as long as you want to ask questions, or we can call it a night. Thank you very much.
Just one question.
Yeah.
You mentioned that you were with Coca-Cola.
Yes.
What years was that?
1997 to 2001? Huh? No, I wouldn't. No, well, we were in Atlanta 6 years, but I joined Coca-Cola at the absolutely worst time.
I was trying to place you there when somebody I knew was there.
Yeah, so late 90s, 1990s, early 2000s, I'm pretty sure. So Coca-Cola had a product problem toward the end of my career. The Dasani water was causing people to get sick and die in Europe, and they weren't really stepping up to the plate like Johnson & Johnson did with the Tylenol scare, if you remember that one. And they changed management at Coke, and to keep this story short, a team of different people came in to run the company, and they were not as interested in having big, massive marketing departments in Atlanta. So the first year of cutbacks, my department gets shrunk in half, and the next year it's just me, and then the next year, poof, I'm gone. But they treated me nice. They were good, you know. But I wish I had written a book about my days at Coca-Cola. That would have been a book.
I worked with Ken Erickson, who was
Oh yeah. I had,
country club when I was there.
oh yeah, it still is probably. They were, we could talk. I won't get into it. So thank you.
Thank you, Jack. Thank you so very much. Was this good,
My
folks?
pleasure.
It's good?
Thank
Yes.
you.
So we do have a few more moments here. The books will be available, and I believe he might have an ink pen there that he could sign them for you all. Thank you so very much. Thank you for those of you all watching online. If you all would like to watch this again, please visit the Hampton History Museum's Facebook or our YouTube page, where this video will be archived. Thank you so very much. Please have a great evening. Be safe.
Get home safe. Thank you.